It was a fairy tale wedding, but for Claire Morris, there would be no happy ending.
He decided he was going to stage a road traffic collision and effectively set the vehicle on fire, with his wife in the passenger seat incapacitated, and effectively burn her to death.
Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Malcolm Webster as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? Claire Morris was a happy little girl. She was close to her family.
We've been a close family since we lost my dad when we were 7 and 9 respectively, and Claire was more the practical person. She'd help around the home a bit more. She was gardener and that sort of thing. But she was a good sister.
But for the little boy who would grow up to marry Claire, life was less simple.
It does seem that Malcolm Webster had quite a strange childhood. I don't think it's one that we would describe as particularly normal or even functioning incredibly well. His dad was in quite a powerful job in the police force. He was head of the fraud squad, and it's said by people that he was an incredibly controlling man, and he ruled his family. And I think Malcolm especially felt that he was at the bottom, the very bottom of the pecking order.
He stood out for all of the wrong reasons. He was not like other boys.
There were some behavioural difficulties noted with Malcolm Webster. From when he was a child, he was known to be attention-seeking. He always wanted attention, but he always seemed to want to get his own way as well. And he would often fake illnesses, and he would pretend to faint, and that probably got him the attention that he was craving at the time.
There are many occasions where we've got evidence that even as a youngster, again going back to his teenage years, where he'd feigned the fact that he had a brain tumour, a life-threatening illness.
Webster struggled to carve out a place for himself, but finally settled on a career.
He decided that he wanted to train to be a nurse. His mother had been a nurse, and I suppose it's not that surprising given that he was always ill himself or feigning illness himself.
It was this career choice that brought him into contact with Claire Morris.
Claire was a nurse. She'd been a nurse for some years. She'd done all training in London. She'd put her career as an important thing, and she put that in front of relationships. She wanted to get qualified as a state registered nurse, and then I think she specialised in eye care.
The pair met at a house party in London and hit it off immediately.
She was sharing a house in Dulwich with some friends, and I believe that she met Malcolm at a party, after which the next day he came down and was showering her with flowers and gifts and what have you. And he seemed a gentleman. He seemed the sort of person that Claire would be interested in, and it didn't take long for her to fall for him.
The couple moved to rural Scotland, and in the early 90s, they married. Claire's brother vividly recalls the happy day.
It was a traditional Scottish wedding, had a bit of class to it. Not so much a disco afterwards as a ceilidh, which is good fun, all prancing about, doing silly dances, and they thoroughly approved it.
The wedding day appeared perfect, but Webster's vow, till death us do part, masked a more sinister motive.
It seems that after they got married in 1993, that's when Webster really starts to escalate things. It's like, you know, he's got the marriage now, he's safe in that relationship. It means he's got entitlements from that relationship. And we see during that time that Claire had 10 life insurance policies against her life and a big mortgage protection policy. So it seems that even before they were married, and definitely after they got married, he had a plan that this marriage was not going to last.
Malcolm suggested Claire make a will too.
About 2 years in, he gets Claire to change her will, and he is the sole beneficiary. He gets absolutely everything. Probably didn't raise any red flags for her, because that's not necessarily an unusual thing for a committed couple to do.
Claire was deeply in love with Webster. Her brother noticed the intense hold that he had over her.
Well, there were times when Malcolm told her to take her hands out of her pockets, and she did. If I'd told that to Claire, she'd have told me to clear off. He'd managed to sort of wind this spell over her, really, but at the time, he wound that spell over all of us.
By spring 1994, Claire's health was deteriorating.
On many occasions in the early months of their marriage, friends, family of Claire noticed, indeed Claire herself was concerned that she was undergoing periods of blackouts, dizziness. Clearly she knew herself that there was something wrong within her, and Malcolm, he would sideline that and he would minimise it and trivialise the symptoms that she was suffering from. But friends and family, she visited her GP, they thought it was perhaps epilepsy.
She's tired, she's confused, she's forgetting things, and she doesn't know what's going on. That's terrifying for her. But there is her husband saying, don't worry, rely on me, and I will take care of it all, because you are clearly not capable.
There was much Claire didn't know about her new husband. She had no idea he was secretly feeding her sedatives.
He was using a combination of epilepsy drugs and sleeping tablets, whose effect, of course, is to make you drowsy. And I don't think there's any much doubt that what he was trying to do at the very least was to cause Claire to become more malleable, more confused, more uncertain, more under his influence.
But that wasn't all. Malcolm was hiding his lifelong fascination with fire. Since his school days, he'd been a pyromaniac.
He was known in his friendship group, or with the people that knew him anyway, the children that knew him, for setting fires. He would brag about his skill in setting fires.
Mid-1994, and the Websters appear a happy couple. No one is suspicious of the insurance policies taken out on Claire's life. Nobody would have guessed that Claire's pyromaniac husband had hidden several cans of petrol in the boot of their car. And Claire herself would never have imagined that to Malcolm Webster, she was of more value dead than alive. Malcolm Webster had always loved acting, and it seemed he didn't know when to stop.
His whole adult life was nothing other than a performance. He was into amateur drama as a young man, and I think he played that through for the rest of his days.
His thespian abilities were to stand him in good stead as he embarked on a plan to kill. In May 1994, Webster bought a new car and began researching the local roads. And on the 27th of May, just 8 months after their wedding day, tragedy struck.
The circumstances on the night were that he enticed his wife to join him on an unnecessary journey from their farmhouse to the city of Aberdeen, some 15, 16 miles away, to drop off some paperwork to do with a project. So that created the reason to have to be in the vehicle at that particular time of night. and she came with him.
We don't know what was going through Webster's mind when he decided to kill Claire Morris, but we do know that he had planned it carefully. He had found a site where he could drive the car into a tree, and he deliberately increased the dose of medication that he gave her.
He gave her sedatives until she was unconscious, and then he carried her to the car, put the seat down so that as he was driving, nobody would be able to see that she was in the car.
One can only imagine at that point that she'd been heavily sedated, because she must have fallen asleep very quickly in the prone position in the passenger seat. So then, at the predetermined location, he drove the vehicle off the road at a very low speed, did impact with a tree with the front of the vehicle.
Webster was not finished. His boyhood fascination with fire, combined with his desire for money, meant that he had one more scene to play out.
And then he simply emptied petrol fuel in the vehicle, set it on fire, and then passers-by effectively intervened. But remarkably, he maintained at least one, possibly two of the first witnesses who arrived on the scene, because the question was asked, is there anybody else in the vehicle? And he was adamant no.
On 2 occasions he was asked if there was anybody else in the car, and he denied it. And it was only when the thing actually exploded into flames that he said that, oh, my wife's in there.
The man who had so recently promised to love and to cherish Claire now stood and watched while she burnt to death.
I have rarely heard anything more calculating in my life. If she was very lucky, she may have stayed unconscious as a result of those drugs. If she was not, then she died in agony.
What that did to Claire in the car was inhuman. Her skull was welded to the back of the chair at the front. Her bones were welded to the seat. Some wonderful fireman had to do his best to get what was left of her up and into an ambulance. It's vile.
The grieving widower played his part well. He was above suspicion, even to those he was closest to.
Up in Scotland, it's actually male members of the family that carry out the coffin. And me and a few of my cousins were doing that. And it was when they put Claire on my shoulder that I actually cracked. Yeah, the sky had collapsed for me. And I do remember that feeling quite sorry for myself, and then looking up at Malcolm, who was on my right, and thinking, wow, I've lost my sister, but he's lost his wife. And as they lowered Claire into the grave, I had a cord in this hand, which was with several other cords lowering the coffin down, and with this hand I was holding on to Malcolm and squeezing his hand. And I looked up at him, and he was in tears as well.
Now it was time for Webster to cash in, claiming on the insurance policies. He was finally a man of means, but the money didn't last long.
Having accumulated significant wealth and benefited from Claire's death to the sum of well over £200,000, which in the 90s was a significant, this remains a significant amount of money, but he managed to squander that very, very quickly. So within 6 months of Claire's death, he found himself in a situation where he was pretty much empty in the bank.
But Malcolm Webster knew how to get rich quick. He had a formula. Meet, marry, murder.
If he was to analyse how he'd conducted the murder of Claire, it was a perfect plan from its inception through execution. He got away with it, so why wouldn't he do the same again?
Newly single and now stony broke, Malcolm Webster left the UK. It wouldn't be long before he met a young woman, and in 1996 they married.
All I'd heard from Mum was that he got married again. He'd met somebody in Saudi Arabia and he got married again. That's literally all I knew. I didn't know who it was, what nationality she was, or anything like that.
The many faces of Malcolm Webster were on display with a nurse called Felicity Drum. The couple set up home in her native New Zealand. Webster had married. Now he wanted money.
So in the relationship with Felicity, he starts to repeat the pattern, almost exactly the relationship that he had with Claire. He starts giving drugs to Felicity. She starts feeling again vulnerable and tired and fatigued. And after they got married, practically the first day after they got married, he gave her such a huge dose of sedative that she slept for 36 hours.
And so clearly, even in the very, very early stages of their relationship, he was putting his plan into action.
This is a man who didn't just not care for his wife or his wives. This is a man who cared for nobody and had not a shred of compassion for anybody.
When the unsuspecting Felicity became pregnant, the couple moved to Scotland. The pregnancy did little to put Webster off his stride.
Here was a man who was prepared to feed drugs to his wife, knowing, as a nurse, the effects they might have while she was pregnant. He was prepared to continue to feed her drugs, which might well affect the health of their baby once it was born and she was breastfeeding. And while his wife was pregnant, he almost certainly set a fire in their house, planning to kill her and their unborn child.
In the winter of 1998, a fire broke out in the Websters' home. The blaze forced the family's return to New Zealand, where they stayed with Felicity's parents. Malcolm was growing ever more desperate for money. The result? Another fire.
Certainly, during his marriage to Felicity, he had set fire or had laid fires on one occasion with his infant son and his wife and her parents, all asleep in the same house.
Having been living with Felicity's parents, the Websters were keen to move on. They planned to buy a house, but Webster was a worried man. He knew that close scrutiny by Felicity of her bank account would reveal an ugly truth. He'd been stealing. The solution? Kill Felicity.
On the morning that he attempted to murder Felicity, they were going to the bank, they were going to meet with their solicitors. And that was going to unveil the fact that he had no money in the account. He had embezzled money from her account. So he knew that that was not going to be a good meeting. So he was pretty much forced into that journey being the journey where he had to do this.
Webster's carefully laid plan was about to be undone. He had to act.
He starts to say that the steering has gone funny and he can't control it, and the car seems to veer at high speed towards a pole in the road. So it's the passenger side that's heading towards the pole. But Felicity manages to grab the steering wheel and they do come to a halt.
Incredibly, Felicity survives the crash. But just a week later, a family excursion and another attempt to kill his second wife.
To cut a long story short, he'd attempted to kill Felicity in the same way that he did kill Claire. And it was her mobile telephone going off with a call from her father that woke her up out of her stupor.
He's shouting at her to stay in the car, stay in the car. He doesn't want her to get out of the car. He's making his way to the boot where again he has put cans of petrol. And it seems that his intention was that he was going to set fire to the car.
This was a man who didn't just not care for this woman, he didn't care for any woman. Money and insurance policy was more important to him than anything.
The real Malcolm Webster had yet to be uncovered to the outside world. For many, he was simply a loving husband. What mistake would it take to uncover a killer? Malcolm Webster had already killed his first wife and tried to kill his second. For Felicity Drum's family, events simply didn't add up. But the evidence against Webster did.
After the crash, the car gets towed away, it's getting taken to a garage, and Felicity's sister goes to the garage, and the mechanic there tells her that there's nothing wrong with the steering at all.
The petrol cans were found in the rear of the vehicle by Felicity's brother-in-law. There was a cigarette lighter found in the console of the vehicle, which was odd because neither of them smoked. There were scrunched up newspapers, and all of this led them to think that something really suspicious had happened.
At this point, Felicity started putting the pieces together and started to make sense of some of the things that had been happening to her, that she was now seeing in a new light. So she made a statement to the police about her suspicions, and she included in that she hadn't been feeling well. So they tested her hair, and as a result of those tests, they found out that she had been drugged for quite a long period of time.
Malcolm Webster knew the game was up.
Once the house of cards began to tumble in New Zealand, and he realised that the game was up, he had to get out of there. And that's when he returned to the UK and effectively went into phase 3 of his life, if you like.
There was little police in New Zealand could do. They had suspicions, but with insufficient evidence there could be no arrest or extradition application. However, to some, there was little doubt as to Webster's intentions.
The sister, and indeed the local police, believed that Webster had tried to murder Felicity in a staged road traffic accident. But by this time, Malcolm was back in the UK.
Some years later, in 2008, Felicity's sister Jane visited the UK. She was on a course with police officers about domestic abuse. She took the opportunity to talk to one detective.
What Jane wanted to do while she was in the UK was seek out Webster and confront him, and she was angry with him. This was there'd been no justice at all, and she wanted to go and she wanted to confront him.
However, the police officer persuaded her that that was probably not a good idea. But to her credit, the police officer contacted what was then Grampian Police, and I had a conversation with her, and we agreed that we would send detectives down to England to interview Felicity's sister in full.
Police were quickly convinced by what they'd heard, and they launched Operation Field.
The circumstances of the road traffic accident involving Claire, his first wife, were remarkable, and the circumstances in New Zealand involving the road traffic accident with Felicity were remarkable, but when you overlaid and put the two together, they were compellingly striking in terms of the similarities. And so that largely was the catalyst for another wave of investigation, but it needed more than that. It needed something tangible, something solid to actually ignite the second investigation, if you like.
But records from the crash that killed Claire Morris were of little help.
Malcolm Webster effectively carried out the perfect murder, because he was never a suspect, because there was never a crime. Had there been a connection that was a crime, he would have very quickly have been in the frame, and very quickly I'm sure the evidence would have been there to support it, because there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, and clearly the toxicology of the post-mortem would have very much been focused on sedatives. But at that time, it was only an alcohol screening that was carried out. The pathologist, Dr. James Grieve, very highly experienced, highly respected gentleman, he did have a meticulous record of what had happened in the original post-mortem.
What the investigation needed was solid evidence, something tangible.
That physical evidence came from another remarkable source, and that was a small piece of liver tissue from the original post-mortem of Claire back in 1994. And with the passage of time and the advance of science, the toxicology around that was remarkable.
They found a way of testing it for unnatural substances, and with this new method they found temazepam in that sample, and that it was a 90-something% chance that it was temazepam, and that is not something that could be naturally in there from the body generating it. It would have to be planted there.
This tiny sliver of liver led to the remarkable outcome for us as investigators that there was indeed clear evidence, scientific evidence, that there was sedative in that liver tissue, which then entirely changed the circumstances of an original road traffic collision, because all the circumstances indicated that somehow Claire must have been incapacitated at the time of the collision, because there was no other way of explaining why she didn't escape from the vehicle herself.
To strengthen their case further, police returned to the collision that had killed Claire Morris.
They said it was an accident. So you think, well, people have accidents, you know, and that was my visualisation of it. He said that he'd swerved to avoid a motorcycle. Unless you're detached from that person and looking at it in the cold light of day, it's very difficult to be suspicious when somebody has, prior to that, gained your trust. But if I'd been a policeman or a fireman or something like that, and I had known Malcolm, then I might have been able to look at it with more constructively critical eyes.
That critical eye was to come from specialist crash scene investigators who focused on the speed of the collision.
Investigators are pretty good at estimating a speed from the damage that's presented on the vehicle. And there's lots of research papers to support that too. So it would be relatively obvious, standing at the scene of this collision, that you were dealing with a low speed impact as opposed to quite a high velocity energy exchange.
Webster had claimed to have swerved to avoid a motorcycle, a story which now appeared flawed.
If you're dealing with an evasive steer, a case where a driver's reacting to a hazard in the road, say an oncoming vehicle or an animal or something like that, you would expect a significant amount of steering to be applied very quickly indeed. It doesn't lose a lot of speed as it's travelling across the road, so it would be slightly unusual to end up with quite a low speed impact at the end of a swerve or an evasive manoeuvre.
Crash investigators now turned their attention to the fire that engulfed Claire's car.
In this case, there were witnesses that described the fire took hold of the vehicle 15 or 20 minutes after the original collision. Whilst fires take a while to propagate through a vehicle, this would be the case when the vehicle is colder than it was at the time of the collision. We also look at that in conjunction with the fact that it was a very low speed impact. We have a low speed impact and a late onset of a fire. That would be very unusual.
Satisfied that Claire's accident was deliberate, the investigation revisited the incident in New Zealand.
Webster's allegation in the second collision was that there was a defect with the steering that caused him to swerve across the road. It's highly unlikely that a defect to any part of the steering system would cause the vehicle to swerve across the road in the way that it did.
As police investigated Malcolm Webster, he was in the Scottish Highlands with a woman called Simone Banerjee, who he'd met in 2004 and who knew nothing of his past or what he had planned.
He had no care for anyone except himself. Every time he met somebody, he was planning to get their money and kill them.
The net was closing in on killer Malcolm Webster. police working to bring him to justice for the murder and attempted murder of his first 2 wives. But Webster, once again, is a man with a plan. Engaged to be married, he can't allow his past to catch up with him.
I took a phone call from Webster, who had heard that there was investigations ongoing into the death of Claire. And he was highly indignant. He was pseudo-aggressive in terms of how could you possibly think that I could be involved in anything to do with Claire's death. Very dramatic phone call. Definitely a determined phone call to try and, for whatever reason, convince somebody on the other end of a phone that he wasn't involved in his murder. And it struck me as being somewhat pathetic that somebody might think that they could, in a phone call, just douse down the interest in a murder investigation.
Living and working in Argyll for Malcolm Webster and his new fiancée Simone Banerjee, life seemed good. She did not know about his past or that he had a wife and child in New Zealand. Furthermore, she didn't know of his history of faking illnesses.
We know that he, on several occasions, groomed women through sympathy in relation to apparent terminal illnesses such as leukemia.
Munchausen syndrome, where people pretend or feign illness, even poison themselves in order to get medical attention, is not unknown. We know that Webster would have been very aware that illness brings with it attention. After all, he had been a nurse.
Planning a honeymoon aboard their yacht, nurse Simone Banerjee could not have imagined her fiancé's cancer was bogus.
And in fact, he went to the extent of apparently going for chemotherapy, and in absence from the family home, he was actually engaging with other women, but he would return home with his head shaven, his eyebrows shaven, apparently as part of his chemotherapy. So that was the extent that he would go to. And again, that pattern of behaviour continued. And again, it was an ingredient in the relationship that he had with the latest lady in Argyll, where, as a nurse, and her friend as a nurse were convinced that he had leukemia.
Police were watching Webster and becoming increasingly concerned for his fiancée's safety.
If you take all of the circumstances of Claire's murder and the staged accident and the death and the insurance payout, and if you take all of the circumstances and ingredients of what he did with Felicity in New Zealand, the staged accident, the insurance, the signing over of the house, the estate, all of the ingredients are there. And when you look at his relationship with the lady Simone in Argyll, again, there was a relationship building with a woman of some wealth. There wasn't the insurance wraparound at that particular point in time, but there was the bequeath, the signing over of a house that was worth £250,000. There was a yacht that was worth a substantial amount of money that he had a half share in. So again, it wouldn't be too difficult to draw some conclusions potentially of what was going to be the outcome.
Malcolm was supposed to be taking her on a boat for several weeks, and it turned out that he'd actually damaged her life jacket. This person was going to kill again.
When it became known that they were about to embark on a fairly lengthy yacht trip around the Canaries, that's when the decision was taken that something had to be done. And so there was an intervention through what we call an Osman warning, where if the police become aware of intelligence that they believe that someone's life is in danger, then you're obliged to advise and notify that individual. You don't have to reveal the source of that suspicion or intelligence or information, but there is a duty of care in terms of advising, and of course that's what was done. Simone was warned that there was a genuine belief that she was in a relationship with a dangerous individual, who had a history that would suggest that she needed to think very carefully about continuing that relationship.
Malcolm Webster fled to Surrey, where in February 2009 he was finally arrested and charged with the murder of Claire and the attempted murder of Felicity. Police had a dossier of circumstantial evidence, but could they find something tangible that would reveal the killer's mistake? At his trial, a jury heard about his pyromania.
There are so many incidents of fire that Webster was involved in. 2 houses, one in New Zealand, one in Scotland, went on fire that he was responsible for. Obviously, the tragic fire involving Claire. But beyond that, there were other incidences of fire, even up until months before he was arrested. In the hospital that he was working in Argyll, there was a fire in a dustbin, which he found and doused out and became a bit of a hero. Because undoubtedly Webster needed to be the centre of attention. So the fires were a real feature of Webster's life.
And there were those that were prepared to testify to that.
We randomly got a phone call from a police sergeant in England, Kent, Surrey, I think, who had seen the publicity, had recognised Webster, and recognised him as a fellow scout when they were 14, 15 years old. And he was compelled to tell us that even in those days, young Webster had a reputation involving fires. So on scout trips, things had gone on fire and Webster was never far away. And that nickname he had, which there's a certain irony in, and the nickname was Pyro.
During the trial, Claire's brother Peter would learn of a much darker side to his brother-in-law.
I mean, one of the things that I asked Derek Ogg, the QC, at the time of the trial was that after the supposed accident, and Malcolm had been picked up by an ambulance and taken to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, they tested his pulse and that was normal. They tested his pupil dilation and that was normal. And I said to Mr. Ogg, how can that be? Because if you've been in a genuine accident, your pulse and everything would be all up anyway because of the shock of what's happened. And if you committed a crime, surely you'd be excited as well. So how could they be normal? And his reply to me was astonishing. He said, Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it. Which I didn't even know people like that existed prior to this. That is something for me which is astonishingly scary.
So what was the cause of his ultimate downfall, the killer's mistake?
He underestimated people. He was very confident of his own intelligence, his own planning. He thought that he had covered all the bases, but actually this wasn't a clever man. This was a manipulative man. But when you look back, most of the things he did were quite clumsy. Things like telling the people who turned up at the accident there was no body in the car. He didn't even think that there would be evidence in his wives' bodies of the drugs that he was giving them. He decided to repeat what he'd done. So one car crash is unusual when it kills somebody. To have two, and then to have a third person who's being drugged. So I think that his arrogance and his overconfidence in himself underpinned all of those clumsy mistakes he made that made it easier for the police, even looking back at these as historic crimes, to prove that he was a liar.
Here we have a man who cares absolutely nothing for anybody and will allow nothing to get in the way of him achieving what he wants. He is a highly calculated man. He is an intelligent man, and he is a man who has become overconfident because he has believed that he has got away with his crime. So here is a man whose life is gradually causing him to have a higher and higher inflated view of his own ability to evade justice.
An arrogant man, but crucially also a greedy one.
Of course, the overriding motive in all of Webster's actions will come back to his greed, his insatiable desire for wealth. I think he lived his life in a complete fantasy, and he was successful in many ways in terms of his goal of making money out of that, until eventually his greed tripped him up.
Webster's mistakes would cost him dear. On the 5th of July 2011, he was sentenced to life and will serve a minimum of 30 years. The judge likened his case to that of a puzzle.
I think it was well described as being like a 1,000-piece jigsaw that was strewn across the floor, and until such time as the jigsaw was put together, not just by the police but by family, by friends, there was a whole network who helped put this jigsaw together, but only then did it become clear that Webster's whole life was predicated on lies, fantasy, wealth-driven plans to take advantage of women, often vulnerable women who fell for him. He was a charmer. He was a quintessential English gentleman.
Yet he felt no remorse for his crimes.
He had no problem with discarding people's lives, and no remorse or regret for doing so.
No, he's never shown remorse. He's never admitted his guilt. He maintains his innocence to this day, but that's not unusual. That's not to be... you wouldn't necessarily be surprised at that, because he probably right now is sitting in a cell in prison, still feeling a little bit hard done by. That's the reality that is Malcolm Webster.